Welcome back, Design Junkies, to Mechanical Engineering Made Simple. Today we're diving deep into basically the blueprints for profit. This deep dive is our shortcut, really, to understanding those critical decisions, the ones that let you build products efficiently, cost-effectively. We're looking at, well, everything from setting that upfront cost target, classifying materials, managing those complex production flows, and using tools like design for manufacturing and assembly.
Yeah, and that upfront focus it's everything, isn't it? The real core challenge is getting that congruence. You need the product design, how it looks, what it does to perfectly mesh with the design of the manufacturing processes, the ones that actually make the thing. Success really boils down to three things: time to market, cost, and quality. Get those early choices right, and, well, those three metrics tend to fall into place.
Right. So the big goal, fundamentally, is turning raw stuff into finished products profitably. But you can't just wait until it's on the factory floor to figure out the cost. You need that target way earlier, right at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And the sources we looked at were really emphatic about this. These aren't just like nice ideas, they're rules. Rule number one: the product development team must get a specific unit manufacturing cost, a UMC target, right at the start.
Okay. Non-negotiable?
Non-negotiable. And rule number three follows right on. They have to be held accountable for hitting that target.
Right.
And to do that, you need to understand the formula. It's UMC equals BL plus MC plus TA.
Okay. Let's break that down. BL.
BL is burdened assembly labor. So that's not just the wages, right?
Oh.
It's the direct labor plus benefits plus all the relevant overhead costs tied to that labor.
Got it. Overhead included. MC.
MC is material costs. That's the raw materials, packaging, plus things like duty, freight, insurance, sometimes called DIP, and also material acquisition cost. It all adds up.
Okay. And TA.
TA is tooling amortization, basically the cost of your fabrication tools, your molds, divided by the total number of units you expect to build over the product's entire life.
Wow. Okay, so there are a lot of sort of hidden layers in there that maybe management sometimes misses. But looking at that equation, BL plus MC plus TA, one of those usually stands out, doesn't it? MC, the material cost.
Oh, absolutely. Consistently
But
dominating.
it's not just big. Some studies say material costs can be like 60, even 80% of the total UMC.
Easily. Yeah, 60 to 80% is pretty typical. And that right there tells you something huge. Your biggest leverage point for cutting cost isn't usually shaving 5% off assembly labor. It's figuring out how to use less material or cheaper material.
So part reduction and smart material choices are just critical.
Absolutely critical, which leads us perfectly into DFM&A.
Design for manufacturing and assembly.
Right. It's this technique specifically aimed at slashing product cost by, well, simplifying the design down to its essential components.
Yeah.
It forces the design team to think about assembly, material flow really early on, not just, throwing it over the wall later.
Yeah, not as an afterthought.
It's exactly. The goals are pretty straightforward. Cut the part count, integrate parts and processes where you can, and by doing that, minimize the assembly work and cost.
I saw this great cautionary tale in the source material, this fictional Ajax Bull Corporation memo.
Yeah.
It perfectly showed what happens when managers think they're doing DFM&A, but they're actually undermining the whole concept. This memo basically said manufacturing would only get involved like a couple of times, planned occasions, because engineering was worried that manufacturing's input would, quote, drag on schedule, and they'd waste time defending and arguing the design.
Wow.
Their definition of concurrent engineering was literally, engineering designs it, manufacturing is forced to agree, minimal input allowed.
That's just setting yourself up for failure, a cost disaster waiting to happen. Because they completely miss the ripple effect of simplification. When you genuinely cut parts, you don't just save the cost of that part, all the overhead tied to that part, tracking it, storing it, inspecting it, that just vanishes.
Right.
Your quality goes up instantly, fewer places for things to go wrong, assembly time drops, and crucially, the whole product development cycle gets shorter. It's a win-win-win.
So for you listening, wanting to apply this kind of radical simplification, what are the key principles? How do you actually do it?
Okay, key DFA principles. First, design parts with self-locating features. Make them easy to put in the right place. Self-fastening features help too.
Okay.
Second, use multifunctional parts whenever possible. Combine functions into one piece. Third, eliminate assembly adjustments completely. They are just sources of complexity and error.
Get rid of the tweaking.
Exactly. And fourth, drive standardization. Standardize fasteners, components, materials, processes. Use the same stuff across different products.
Okay, so we've simplified the design. Now, how do we organize all this engineering knowledge? keep track of these parts and processes effectively.
That's where group technology, or GT, comes in. It's all about grouping things. GT essentially takes different work pieces and puts them into logical part families based on similarities and how they're made or how they're designed. And this whole process starts with parts classification and coding, which is really crucial for things like automating processes or even just finding existing designs so you don't reinvent the wheel.
Right, design retrieval. And the theory behind classifying these parts seems pretty straightforward based on sort of three ideas.
Yeah, it's quite elegant, actually.
Yeah.
Premise one.
A part is best defined by its most obvious feature, its basic shape. Is round, flat, cubic.
Okay, basic shape first.
Second, special features, holes, threads, slots, they're just added onto that basic shape.
Superimposed.
Exactly. And third, you can fully describe a workpiece by looking at its basic shape, those special features, its overall size, the required precision, and finally, the material type and form.
And that structure leads to these codes, right? Like an 8-digit code? Often, yeah. An 8-digit code is common, broken into sections. Basic shape, form features, size, precision, material. These codes aren't the whole story. They're pointers to the detailed info.
Makes sense.
Now, how you structure that classification? There are a couple of ways. There's the E-tree concept. Think of it like a strict hierarchy, like a family tree where everything fits neatly into one branch. Mutually exclusive categories.
One part, one family.
Right. Then there's the N-tree concept. This allows for non-mutually exclusive paths. So a part could belong to multiple groups based on common features. It's useful for attributes like, say, needs welding or has internal threads, things that might apply across different basic shapes.
I see. And this isn't just for metal parts, is it? You can classify materials too.
Oh, definitely. A really comprehensive system, like the engineering materials taxonomy mentioned in the sources, goes way beyond just metals. It describes something like 79 different material families, including composites, ceramics, plastics, all sorts. Having that kind of system just makes life easier for everyone, helps designers pick materials faster, improve communication between departments, cuts down search time. It's about systemizing knowledge.
Okay, so knowledge systematized, parts simplified. Now we need to actually make them and get them to the customer on time. This moves us into production planning, right? Starting with forecasting.
Exactly. Factory floor planning. Forecasting is step one. And quantitatively, you've basically got two main flavors. First is time series analysis. That's using historical data, plotted over time, looking at past sales trends, that kind of thing.
Looking backwards to predict forwards.
Pretty much. The second is causal methods. This tries to find relationships between what you want to predict, like demand and other independent factors, maybe using tools like regression analysis.
Okay, so you've got your forecast. Now you need a plan to get the materials in-house. That's MRP territory, materials requirements planning.
Yes, and MRP is crucial, but it's for a specific situation.
Yeah.
The key thing about MRP is you use it when the demand for a component is dependent on something else, like you only need screws when you're building the main product. And when that demand is irregular and highly varying, it jumps around a lot.
So not like a steady, constant demand you might see for finished goods at a supermarket.
Exactly the opposite. Traditional inventory models often assume constant demand, which just doesn't work for components deep inside a bill of materials. You can't just set a simple reorder point.
So what's the big win with MRP then?
The huge benefit is inventory reduction. It lets a business keep much lower average inventory levels because you're not just holding stock just in case. You use scheduled procurement, you schedule manufacturing to happen just before the parts are actually needed based on that dependent demand. Saves a ton on holding costs.
Makes sense. Schedule it tight. And then finally, the parts arrive at the assembly line. Now we're talking sequencing.
Right. Getting the work done efficiently on the line. The main goal here is assembly line balancing. You're trying to assign all the little tasks, the work elements, to the different workstations along the line in a way that minimizes the total idle time, what they call balance delay, while making absolutely sure you follow the required order of operations, the precedence relationships.
Got to do step A before step B.
Precisely.
All right, let's shift gears to the actual manufacturing processes, the tools in the toolkit. Sometimes the standard stuff just won't cut it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You run into situations where conventional machining, milling, turning, grinding just isn't the right answer. That's when non-traditional machining processes become essential. You'd look at these when you need really complex shapes or maybe incredibly small features. Or when the material is super hard, think harder than, say, 400 Brinell.
Okay.
Also, when you need extremely tight tolerances, and this is often critical, when you absolutely have to avoid heating up the part or leaving residual stresses on the surface.
So these are like the special forces of machining. Can you give some examples?
Sure, laser beam machining, LBM, uses a super focused beam of light to melt or vaporize material away. Incredible energy density.
Like a tiny, precise cutting torch.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's electrochemical machining, ECM. This removes conductive material using an electrolyte bath and electric current, basically, controlled corrosion. And you can reverse it, sort of, for electrochemical deburring, ECD, just to clean up edges.
Clever.
And a really common one is electrical discharge machining, EDM. Uses rapid sparks between a tool and the workpiece in a dielectric fluid. The cool thing about EDM is it works great on really hard materials, doesn't really care about toughness.
Oh, okay, powerful tools. Now, switching to putting things together, mechanical fasteners, bolts, rivets. There's some interesting physics there with bolted joints.
Yeah, especially with high-strength bolts. When you tighten a bolt, you apply a preload. This actually stretches the bolt slightly, makes it longer.
Is it just a stiff spring?
Exactly. And at the same time, it compresses the parts being joined together, the joint itself. You can visualize this with a joint diagram. It plots force versus deflection, showing the stiffness of the bolt, let's call it K sub B, and the stiffness of the joint, K sub J.
K sub B for bolt, K sub J for joint stiffness. Okay.
Right. And how these stiffnesses compare is really important for how the joint behaves under load.
So a common design goal is what? Make the joint stiff and the bolt relatively less stiff, like a shock absorber, as you said.
That's often the preferred way, yeah.
Yeah.
A stiff joint and a softer, more elastic bolt. Now, think about what happens when you apply an external pulling force, a tension load, let's call it L sub X, to that assembled joint. That external load gets shared. Part of it increases the tension already in the bolt, that's delta F sub B.
Okay, the bolt stretches a bit more.
And the other part of the load reduces the clamping force that was compressing the joint, that's delta F sub J. With a stiff joint and a softer bolt, the bolt takes most of that external load fluctuation. The change in the clamping force on the joint is relatively small, which is good. You want the bolt to handle the stress, not the joint faces separating.
Right, you don't want the joint popping open.
Precisely. But here's a critical detail that often gets missed. Fasteners aren't static once you tighten them. They relax. Pretty rapidly, actually, right after you tighten them. That initial preload you worked so hard to achieve, it decreases.
It just fades. How much?
It can be significant.
Sure.
The sources cited studies showing this relaxation, this load loss, can vary wildly. In one case, it ranged from just 5% all the way up to 43% of the initial tension.
Wait, 43%? That's almost half the clamping force just disappearing due to relaxation?
Potentially, yeah, if you don't account for it.
Wow. Okay, that single statistic makes understanding bolt relaxation absolutely crucial. You have to design that margin in.
You absolutely do. It highlights the need for precision, not just in manufacturing, but in assembly and design calculations too.
Okay, final stretch. Quality control. We've designed it, built it, fastened it. Now we check it. Let's quickly clarify two terms people sometimes mix up. Tolerance and allowance.
Good idea. They sound similar, but mean different things. Tolerance is the total amount of variation allowed in a specific dimension. It's the plus or minus range the designer gives the machinist, the acceptable wiggle room, basically.
Okay, tolerance is allowable error on one part. What's allowance?
Allowance is about mating parts. It's the minimum clearance space or maximum interference intended between two parts when they fit together. It defines the tightest possible fit the design permits.
So allowance is about the gap between parts. Got it.
Right. Now, when you're actually monitoring production quality on the floor, you use capability limits. These are usually calculated as the process average, X bar plus or minus 3 standard deviations, 3 sigma.
X bar plus or minus 3 sigma, the classic process capability measure.
Exactly. And what that tells you is that your process, running normally, can produce about 99.73% of its output naturally within those limits. The rule of thumb is simple. If the designer's specified tolerance limits are tighter than the machine's natural capability limits, the plus minus 3 sigma range, then you can't rely on statistics. You need 100% inspection for that feature to ensure every part meets the spec.
Makes sense. If the spec is tighter than what the process can reliably hold, you have to check every single one. Okay, so this whole journey from UMC targets, DFM&A, classification, planning, advanced processes, fastening details, quality checks, it all seems to point towards this bigger vision of integration, right? Computer integrated manufacturing, CIM.
Absolutely. That's the ultimate goal for many. CIM aims to link all these islands together, integrating things like CAD and CAM, numerical control machines, robotics, using group technology for efficiency, automated material handling, all coordinated ideally by a central computer-controlled system working in a hierarchy.
Connecting all the dots.
Connecting all the dots. And maybe a final thought to tie it all together. The real key to being truly competitive in manufacturing today goes back to the very beginning, recognizing that the initial decision to simplify the part count, way back in that DFM&A stage, that single choice echoes through everything else. It directly impacts the UMC calculation because material cost drops. It minimizes setup time on your NC machines because you handle fewer unique parts. It inherently reduces the opportunities for defects that quality control has to catch.
So simplification isn't just one step, it's the engine driving efficiency across the entire system.
That's it exactly. Start simple, stay efficient.
To my fellow design junkies, another session in the books. Thanks for grinding with me and sharpening your engineering edge one problem at a time. This show exists because there are people out there who actually care about building things that work, who chase precision, who think in torque curves and tolerances instead of trends. If you're one of them, you're in the right place.